so glad to have you on your show. Your song, 99 Luftballons, that was one of the best anti-war and pro-peace songs. Oh.
Different Nina, David.
I wish it had been me, David.
Sorry. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. My co-host, Gene Hislop. And we have a return visit from Nina Mohadjer, who is, if I pronounce that right, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
Very good.
I'm very bad. I mean, we had Mitch Fuchs on one day, and you can imagine what I did with his name accidentally, sort of. So I get bad with names sometimes. But first of all, introduce yourself to Gene, because Gene, and we'll talk about cultural diversity and how it benefits America. But go ahead.
So, hi, Gene.
Hi.
I'm Nina Mohadjer. David knows a lot about me. I was born in Iran. I came to Germany and was raised there. My parents had immigrated to Germany approximately 50 years ago. And they went back to Iran. My mom gave birth to me, and then we came back to Germany. And now I live since 15 years here in Connecticut.
Oh, that's fantastic. So have you traveled a lot to Iran and spent a lot of time in the Middle East and other countries besides Germany, or?
I spent my childhood, the first 8 years of my life I spent in Iran, visiting a German school though, and also being very German in our household. Basically, my mom speaking only German to us, my father speaking Farsi, having the Persian family, but on the other side having, again, the German friends and the German school environment. Those 8 years shaped my image of the Middle East in a very positive way. Having these great parties with a lot of Persian food, which is absolutely delicious. Have you ever had Persian cuisine?
I love Persian cuisine,
You?
yes.
Have you ever had Persian?
Compared to Indian cuisine.
It's
spicy.
It's less spicy.
Okay.
Less spicy, actually. Less spicy. It can be prepared, like the Chinese cuisine, it can be prepared very, very healthy, but it can be prepared also to a point that after one spoonful of food, you feel you're ready for the emergency room. So depending, you have rice.
So how do you say 12-alarm fire in Persian?
12 alarm fire?
Because they talk about chili, about a bowl of chili in that respect.
Well, you can say the food was very hot. You say غذا خیلی تنده.
غذا خیلی تنده.
غذا خیلی تند ده. And if you want to say it in a literature way, like in a very nice way, you would say غذا خیلی تند است.
Okay, I won't touch that one with it.
Well, the Persian language, the spoken one is slightly different than the written and the formal one, even more than in any other language I experienced. A friend of mine who was fluent in Arabic, she tried to learn Farsi, and she said the grammar was very easy for her. However, just trying to understand the language, what people spoke among each others, and comparing it to the book, she said, I felt like I'm learning two different languages.
Interesting.
So there's a lot more colloquialism, a lot more kind of almost slang, you're saying.
Oh, idiomatic expressions.
Absolutely. I tried, with my two daughters, I tried to teach them how the perfect Persian would be. And they were laughing. They were really laughing because they said, this sounds awful.
Now, is that due to educational disparities in the culture, do you believe?
I wouldn't necessarily say educational disparities. It's just the matter of that the Persian language is so word-rich that even outside poets, in this case, for example, Goethe, learned Persian in order to write his poetry. It's a very rich, very flowery, very beautiful language. And people made it easier for themselves by chopping off the words, by using lighter words, by using less complicated words and less complicated expressions. So if anybody ever spoke like in the books, everybody would stare at you. It's comparable to here in the US if somebody came up to you and said, how do you do?
Correct.
Well, it's correct, and it was used in the 1950s. I just imagine my two daughters' faces.
So it'd be like somebody walking up to you and speaking like Rumi, in a conversation would be like, totally out of place.
And honestly, Jean, I don't think anybody would really understand you unless they'd studied literature, because people who studied even in Iran different subjects, like even law or medicine or anything, if they read Hafez or Rumi, they have to have another lighter book of it next to this so they can understand the words. It's very, very rich. It's worse than worse. That sounds negative, but
more.
I mean, it's more challenging and more difficult than even reading Shakespeare.
And those of us that speak English will vouch for how challenging Shakespeare is to read.
It is.
Exactly. So,
Any of the
a whole
old...
other English language.
Yes. It
exactly.
is, completely. It's like reading the King James Bible versus, the Good News Bible.
Exactly. You being quite knowledgeable about the Bible, you can speak to that. So cultural diversity. You've been an Iranian, you've been a German, and of course now, as we know, as I mentioned earlier on another show, you're a Ridgefieldian, but we'll say American anyway. Cultural diversity. Well, how does it benefit a society to be culturally rich and culturally diverse?
In a humorous way, I could say I can choose my passports and my nationality, or also my culture, based on the color of the passports, which one matches my clothes best. In a more serious way, I would say it helped me much better to get along with people and understand them. But basically putting those boundaries people have by putting a nationality on, or, I mean, obviously these are necessities. You have to have some kind of route to any country, having a passport of any country or so. But in general, I think these are boundaries. If I say I'm Persian or I'm German only and just follow my own path, I lose a lot. I'm actually the loser, and it doesn't give me the opportunity of developing myself. Now, having had the opportunity of living in 3 completely different cultures, I feel I could be transplanted to any country in the world, and I could easily adapt.
3 very divergent cultures can give you a pretty good idea about how the 4th or the 5th or the 6th or the 25th culture might be similar or different than any of those 3.
Exactly.
You're expecting the unexpected.
Exactly, and I give you a sample. For example, in Iran, if you enter a house, you knock at the door, mostly if it's a man who is coming into the house. And this goes back into the history of the country, where houses were built in a way that they were in the middle of this huge garden. They were mostly like mansions, so you would call it in the middle of the bagh. The house was in the middle, then there was a smaller garden around it, which was used by the women of the family, and the larger garden outside, which could be used by men visitors or also women visitors. So what happened is that people would knock at the door if they came into the smaller garden, where women would be without their head coverings, without their hijab. So they would ask for permission if all the ladies are decent, basically. So now in Iran, this continued, and many families, including mine, might not have a hijab. It's absolutely custom for Iranians, mostly men, when they knock at the door and they say, "May I come in?" Say it a couple of times until the women answer actually back and say, "Yes, you may." And it has a very formal, and I know exactly you will ask me to say it in Farsi.
Well, you might as well.
They could knock at the door and say, they usually say, it's an Arabic version, they say, "Ya Allah, ba ijazeh," in Farsi.
Ya Allah, ba ijazeh?
Yeah, and then the women would answer back, "Befarmayit."
Befarmayit?
Befarmayit means you're very welcome. You're welcome to enter the room. So any Persian men just walking into a room which might be occupied by women, this is the biggest insult.
I have to step in because we're graphics denied tonight. There are no graphics available in the studio. So I'm supposed to periodically mention, welcome to Progressive Soup. And our guest tonight is Nina Mohadjer, and we're discussing cultural diversity. Continue.
Okay. So in German, for example, this is a Persian custom. So if somebody in Iran doesn't know about this and just walks into a room, this would be an insult. So basically you should. The cultural diversity allows you to understand when somebody does that, it's easier to grasp this and easier to understand it. Why is this and this happening? So if somebody is more cultural diverse, if you go into any other country and something similar to this happens, or something happens which might not even be similar, but which might be different in your opinion, you might immediately pick up and say, okay, this is the custom here.
Now, a lot of cultures have a more formal side and a less formal side. Is there a less formal version of it, or is it pretty much steadfast that this is the way you would do it? You would show that respect. Are there any shortcuts, any deviations from that are socially acceptable, or no?
Regarding this rule, I wouldn't think so in Iran, unless it's, for example, my brother who's coming. I don't have a brother,
so
but
it could be something more familiar to the family, and they wouldn't have to go through this process.
But they would still knock at the door and say, "Can I come in?"
Yeah.
But here in the U.S., we would do the same thing. I mean,
that's the point I'm trying to get at. Is that in any culture you have that diversity.
It's also, I think, useful because you're less likely to take offense if somebody is an outsider and they don't know that, you know what I mean, or if somebody's just when a person, for instance, moves from Iran to America, and all of a sudden they're thrown into a world where certain social things don't happen, they can understand, well, that's just not done in this culture, so they're less likely to take offense at their own the breaches of their own perceptions of morality or their own experiences. Less likely to take offense because they understand it's a different cultural perspective.
Absolutely, but again, it depends where you're putting that person, where you're putting that Persian, for example, in which area. If you're putting that person into New York City, or to San Francisco, that's a completely different story. So there, because it's a pot full of cultures.
Right.
If you are bringing an outsider to Tehran, or any other big city in Iran, or to the island of Kish, which is very international, that's a completely different story. So it depends also where you're bringing the outsider, whether the lack of knowledge of the particular custom or tradition is acceptable or not.
Okay. Do you find that it is actually more acceptable, I shouldn't say acceptable, is it more easy for a person to come from a Middle Eastern culture and transplant themselves in New York City than it would be for a person from American society to put themselves in Tehran or any other big Middle Eastern city and adjust?
Absolutely. And I tell you the reason. Because when people live in the Middle East, they are very Western-oriented to a part. They might try to say they're not, but already through the film industry. If you go and read certain books, for example, The Kite Runner, there is a scene where the two boys are speaking to each other, and let's put this part aside that they were in Afghanistan and looked at Iran as the country, basically. Just the fact that they looked at American movies, they knew more about American movie stars, they knew more about the music industry, about the fashions that people here know necessarily about over there. If you go and ask any kind of teenager in Tehran, who is the American president, what happened, who was the last American president, what happened, they could name you all of these. On the other side, if you ask them about the fashion, they know all of that. If you ask them what happened in this country or what was part of the American history, they could easily name it for you. However, having two children in the school system here as well, I'm not 100% sure all the children would understand it, because they're so much used to this. This is my country, this is, even though their background is much more diverse. You know, I don't know whether it makes sense, but they go to a certain point, and if I even transplanted my own children to Tehran, I don't know whether they would survive there, to be quite honest.
It is such a very different...
It's a very different culture. So anybody from there coming here is much easier for them.
Do you find that, in other words, are you saying more that people from Middle Eastern countries, because I've seen it in other cultures, like South American cultures, they seem to have a much more global perspective, a much more global sense, like they know what's going on with other countries and histories and cultures and such. People assume that Latin culture, like, okay, Brazilian's this thing and Argentina's this thing. And the fact is, you know, Brazil has a huge Chinese immigrant population and they're very diverse, you know. Do you find that it's similar in the Middle East, that they actually have much more of a global knowledge of other countries and other political systems and other histories and you know, all different manners of culture than, say, American students here have, which is amazing since we are such a melting pot. It seems like we're still so merged in this American culture that we've lost the global perspective. Do you find that that's true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, as I mentioned before, if you go and ask any Iranian student or any German student even about other countries, they know much more and they have much greater interest. And I think here the fact that we are a mixed culture, we took it too much for granted. So if any outsider comes in, we look at that person already as an outsider. We look at different religions, different nationalities differently again. Over there it's much more accepted. Again, with exceptions like of France or any other thing. But all in all, I would say yes, definitely.
Do you think, you know, obviously right now we're in a very tenuous time politically, you know, the nation's emotions are running very hot, and we've seen a lot of Islamophobia happening, sadly, in my opinion, currently. And some of it's understandable with roots, you know, histories and stuff. Some of it, I mean, not the behaviors of Islamophobia are not, you know, understandable or excusable in my opinion. Do you think that there's a way to, I mean, should we be starting with the children? Is there diversity training? What do you recommend that we do more to kind of prevent this hatred and depreciation of other cultures that we're experiencing?
In an ideal world, I would suggest having much more classes in the curricula of making people understand different cultures, telling them, okay, you might be Catholic, you might be Protestant, you might have this religion, there are Buddhists, there are Hindus, there are Muslims, and also showing the children that there are extreme behaviors of any kind of culture or religious group, and then there are those who are more peaceful and moderate in their opinions. The same way talking about Americans do not necessarily mean, being an American, necessarily mean anybody who invaded Iraq.
Right.
You know, there are some who are completely different.
Right.
And who were not a big supporter of that, obviously. So bringing those samples. In a real world, I don't think it is possible, because a lot of very hard-ridden, undiverse people, I call them this way. A lot of undiverse. Basically, those people who say it's only me and anything I do is correct. I don't want to know whether you do things differently. Those who do not follow this. When in Rome, I do it like the Romans, who say if I'm in Rome, I look for my kind of restaurant. I don't want to taste the Italian cuisine. You know, those people who are not willing to learn more about different cultures, or who are so ridden in their opinions, so blocked and so boxed in their opinions. Unfortunately, those people exist, in my opinion. Unfortunately, those people will not allow their children to expand their horizon by thinking outside the boxes, by understanding different cultures. They would be completely against it. So in an ideal world, we would have those classes. In a real world, I think in one of the states here in the U.S., it happened that some teachers wanted to talk about Islam and make children understand that what happened on September 11th, or what some people do, those fundamentalists, what they do is not necessarily representative of the religion in per se. So I think
and with that, I'll step in again and I'll say, this is Progressive Soup, David Stevenson, Gene Hislop, and our guest, Nina Mohadjer. Continue.
And so this is why a lot of people would not expand it unless the children themselves have the interest and start going and start learning about different cultures.
You know, it's strange. When I was growing up, it seems like we were in a gentler time. You know, I can remember having multicultural fairs, you know, quite frequently. Even when my sister was young, my sister's 23 now, I remember going to her school and helping out. You know, my mother had made soda bread, you know, because we're Irish, and, you know, going out and helping out on their diversity day. And, you know, nobody batted an eye. If there was a Persian person there, you know, we were all excited to try the food, you know. Kibbe is one of my favorites. You know, they definitely tried very much to embrace culture, talk about it. It seems like we're actually drifting further and further from that.
In the elementary schools, that still goes on.
Well, it was in junior high and high school, too. We had
Middle
Maybe a
school,
little
we
less,
have that.
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
it depends where we're living. In Ridgefield, for example, or here in Connecticut, I feel, or New York area, tri-state area, this is very much embraced. However, I'm not sure necessarily about
in the Middle East,
Middle
America.
Middle America. I'm not necessarily sure about that area. If somebody like me moved to one of the states, I don't want to name now any state, but one of the
Kansas.
states, for example,
Texas,
you
Illinois,
name it.
you name it.
I don't think I would be very welcome there.
Nebraska. Okay.
There was a movie actually that came out a few years ago, Amrika, which was very, very good. I don't know if you saw it. It was I believe it was a family from Palestine who, it was a mother and son who, you know, came to America, and they wound up in this very small town in Illinois. And, you know, the cultural clash and the unfortunate you know, xenophobia and, you know, all of that came to a head, and how to also preserve your own cultural traditions in addition to adopting new cultural traditions. Fantastic movie, highly recommended, Amrika. But how have you found that you have been able, to preserve your cultural roots and also bring in, you know, American traditions in your own family and culture?
I think that's actually the nature of what you're getting at is what's called small town anywhere.
Yes.
And I've lived in Florida in a little tiny town 30 miles west of Gainesville, and found that it could be very much like a small town anywhere. If you weren't born there, you might as well be from Mars. I think it's the nature of the small town,
I've
rather
had that
than
experience.
the larger metropolitan area you get into, the more diversity and the more you can fit in easier, as opposed to a small town. But yeah.
But in your own family, just asking your own experience, has it been a struggle to preserve your cultural ties, and as well as obviously embrace the American culture? Have your children sometimes felt that you were too traditional or too different or too exotic, or they felt out of place? And what specific things have you been able to do to preserve your cultural traditions and such?
I love your question. This is a very good question. As mentioned, I had already two cultures myself. It was probably more difficult for my parents, who came at the beginning of the 1960s to a Germany which was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. My mom, for example, tells me the stories of she's a petite woman, dark hair, and she was scared of any German because they all looked the same to her.
Yes.
So for them it was probably more difficult to keep the Persian culture and adapt the parts of the German culture as well. For me, I was raised bicultural, always feeling as an outsider in every one of them, until again I felt I break open, I accept everything I like, think outside the box, and say I am a human being. I don't put necessarily a label on myself. Same with the cultures. I celebrate German traditions like St. Nicolaus Day. I celebrate Eid al-Nowruz, which is a Persian New Year. I celebrate Shab Yalda, which is again Persian. I celebrate Ostern, Easter, which is in a very German way. However, on the other side, I slowly, within the past 15 years, I tried to resist myself as well, but slowly I started embracing Halloween and Thanksgiving and certain other, 4th of July, of course, certain other American customs and traditions and holidays. When I now go back to Germany or wherever I go, I feel that I adapted much more to America than I ever wanted to accept, actually. And even my German friends tell me, they say, you are very, very German, but at certain points when we talk to you, we notice you moved away in a way. Not moved on, but you moved away and expanded your horizon. You expanded yourself. Because, again, as we are speaking, the same problems we face in the Middle East or here, the same problems are everywhere. And I think you're right. Like, this is the small town mentality, the small town thinking. I think it depends a lot on the person whether they want to adapt or not. I know enough German or Persian people who do not want to change at all, not understanding that they're losing out on the American culture as well, that they're not accepting anything from here. Or again, others who put all their own traditions aside and from one day to the next say, I'm American. And you go to events where those people are speaking with a heavy accent of their native language, English. They make tons of mistakes. And they try so hard, they force themselves so fakely to imitate the Americanism that it's already ridiculous, that it turns you off in a way. So I think this is a matter of time when you're asking if it was easy for me. It's never easy to change. You know, I always use the Lewis model of change, basically defreezing yourself, adapting whatever you like, putting things you don't like aside, and refreezing yourself again to the same block.
Just before we wrap up, explain further on the Lewis model, because I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, this is actually a model I learned in organizational behavior during my business school. And my professor had mentioned, actually, this class will not only help you in the business environment, this will help you in the personal environment as well. And every change, if you imagine an ice block, it's a block, it's hard, so you imagine all the traditions being frozen in it. So you have to defreeze it, you have to melt it, in order to put those parts aside you don't want and put it into a different shape.
So you're taking an ice block, you're melting it down, and then you're refreezing it into something a little different?
Exactly. So you're refreezing it.
Flexibility.
Exactly. But this requires that the person is willing to defreeze, is willing to let go of certain aspects, and is willing to refreeze again. So while it might be easy with an ice block, it's very difficult with a person because it needs time. And we are naturally impatient. You want from tomorrow on, I will do this and this.
There's no instant microwave that'll.
And with that, we're going to have to wrap up our show. This has been Progressive Soup. David Stevenson, Jean Hislop, and our guest Nina Mohadjer. And we'll enjoy the rest of the evening. You also.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.